What does it take to build one of the leading true crime podcasts in Africa, monetize it, and back it up with books and partnerships? In this launch episode of the South African Podcast of the Month, we celebrate the work of Nicole Engelbrecht, the creator and host of the popular True Crime South Africa and the I Lived Through This podcasts. She's also the author of Samurai Sword Murder, Sizzlers, Killer Stories, and Bare Bones. I asked her what the key turning points were in her podcasting journey.
I would think probably 3 or 4 episodes in when I really started realizing that I could just be myself and listeners would respond to that better than me trying to be what I thought a true crime podcaster sounded like. Because that's, if you listen to my podcast from the beginning, from the first episode, it sounds similar, but when I listen back, I can tell that those first few episodes was me trying to figure out what people wanted to hear rather than just being my authentic self.
We also discuss one of the words we all mention in harsh, painful tones, never to be discussed at the dinner table. Any table that can be flipped in a moment of anger, or anywhere else for that matter, which is monetization.
Yeah, and then the other forms of monetization have been, as you mentioned, the brand sponsorships. And then I'm sure we can get into at some point the sort of branches off from that, which have been into the books and the partnerships with brands like Showmax, and that's, that sort of thing. That's been very helpful as well.
If you're growing a podcast, building an audience, and wondering how you can accelerate that process, this monthly series is for you. I'm your host, Mongezi Mtati, and this is the South African Podcast of the Month, brought to you by the South African Podcasters Guild. Welcome to the South African Podcast of the Month, brought to you by the South African Podcasters Guild. I'm your host. My name is Mongezi Mtati. This series highlights remarkable shows that are shaping culture, shifting the industry, and proving that African podcasts can have a global impact. Every month, we speak to the creators behind the mic, unpacking how they grow their audiences, build sustainable platforms, and sometimes turn passion into revenue. Whether you are a seasoned podcaster or an explorer, there's something here for you. Do you know an outstanding South African podcast? Find the link to a form in our description and let us know. We are always looking for fresh voices and bold ideas. Please subscribe wherever you listen and help us amplify extraordinary voices that are growing Africa's podcast scene. Congratulations on being the first Podcast of the Month episode.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to be the first. That's the first on the podcast. That's awesome. I love that we are highlighting South African podcasts. Juggling the new book that's just come out has been quite hectic with the podcast, but sort of what I've been doing for the last 6 years is just juggling things. So I should be used to it by now.
Doesn't get any easier.
No.
So I think to start off, it's fairly obvious from a listener perspective, but I guess it's sometimes the obvious questions that go overlooked and you don't get insight from them. What gap were you trying to fill when you started your podcast?
So I guess predominantly was the fact that there was no real South African true crime podcast when I started, at its very base. And then also there was nothing there was very few in the market really internationally that were properly victim focused. So for me, that was it. It was going to be a space to elevate the voices of violent crime in South Africa, which sadly we have many, and specifically the ones that don't make the headlines, because I think that's the important voices to elevate.
Was there ever a turning point in the podcast, or I'm sure there were many, but is the one that comes to mind as a turning point that changed how audiences respond to your show or improved their response to your show from an audience perspective?
So I think there were probably two that were very close together, but I think one probably affected the other. And the first was, I would think probably 3 or 4 episodes in, when I really started realizing that I could just be myself and listeners would respond to that better than me trying to be what I thought a true crime podcaster sounded like. Because that's, I mean, if you listen to my podcast from the beginning, from the first episode, it sounds similar, but when I listen back, I can tell that those first few episodes was me trying to figure out what people wanted to hear rather than just being my authentic self. So I think a big turning point was, for me at least, was sort of from episode 4 or 5 onwards is where you start to just get Nicole and not Nicole trying to be a true crime podcaster. And then I think very close tied to that was 2020 was quite a big year for the podcast. Obviously a difficult year for many, many people across the world with the pandemic, but that became a tipping point where I started to see a lot more audience engagement. And I think that drove me as well to carry on.
Yeah. So a couple of things on that. The first one is I've noticed that you are bringing back some of your older episodes sometimes between the newer ones. I was talking to a friend a couple of days ago and they were asking me about the first few episodes. And incidentally, I started in 2020 as well. So I started with a terrible mic and I was in my bedroom and it was a whole lot of things. So, but the bottom line is I've struggled to go back and listen to my first episodes because of the quality. How has it been for you bringing back some of the older stuff and listening to it again and getting feedback on it now that your audience has grown so much?
Mm. Yeah, it's always a little bit cringy, but I always say that if as a podcaster, if you don't cringe at those first few episodes, then I actually think you're doing something wrong because that means that you haven't grown at all in the process. And unless you come into this being as a professional and this is, what you've done your whole life, you have to improve and change along the way. So it is a bit cringy to listen to those first few episodes for me. I even put in these sort of rewind episodes that I've been doing, where I go back to the back catalog. I've put a little bit of a warning in the beginning to explain to people that you are now listening to 2020 Nicole, and you might be used to 2025 Nicole, but this is what 2020 Nicole sounded like. But it's, I love listeners when they start, they find the podcast and they start listening from the beginning. They'll even reach out and say that they love going on the journey with me. And I think that's what it is probably for your listeners as well. They're going on this journey with you of starting out with a terrible mic, not knowing, what a great cadence is and all of those types of things, to better and better and better and just more authenticity, I think is the big thing.
Yes, yes. You've mentioned that around episode 4 is when you started sort of really finding your voice and being confident about how to deliver and about how to create the content. Of course, there are sort of many stats and research, and people throw numbers around. Some will say you only get into the groove after 100 episodes, or you only really know what you're doing after X episodes. What was there ever that point for you?
I don't know that there was that point where I recognized it in the moment. But in retrospect, I think probably by the time I hit about episode 50, I really felt my editing skills were good. I mean, that was something I had to learn from scratch doing this. And I was really finding that I was also feeling that I was able to say things that I perhaps didn't think I could say before. I was quite concerned about what people would think about certain things that I might say. And I think by episode 50, I just felt I've got an audience that values my opinions. They have the same values as me. And as long as I feel like I'm speaking the truth, then it's okay to say what you think. So yeah, I'd say it's probably around episode 50, but that could be different for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What has been the hardest part of growing your audience for you?
I think again, in retrospect, certainly the social media side of it for me, because that wasn't something natural. I had actually gone totally off social media before I started the podcast. I was only going on social media I had accounts, but I was only going on to like share animal rescue posts because I was, quite involved in animal rescue back then. And that was, I think, the hardest part for me was having to open these accounts on these new platforms I wasn't familiar with. I mean, I'd never been on X, which was Twitter back then. Instagram was a whole new world for me. So that was definitely the biggest part of it. And we know it's a very important part.
Yeah.
So that's gotten easier and easier, but I find it quite a strange thing to be sharing these things with the whole world. But yeah, I think definitely think the social media side of it was difficult for me, and maybe that's also a generation thing. The younger podcasters will probably not find that to be the biggest because they've probably lived on social media their whole lives. I'm old enough that I remember when Facebook first came to South Africa. It's that was a whole new world for me. So I think for that was the biggest part of it. But my listeners really pulled in and helped and shared and all of that as well.
Mm. Speaking of social media, and I suppose the platform that you used, which ones drive the most listens and engagement for you?
So it's changed a bit over the years. Still predominantly Facebook. I think the demographic that tends to listen to my podcast is very much on the Meta platforms. So Facebook is always a big one. The Facebook group has got, I think, 24,000 members now. Then Instagram has started to grow a lot. There, I've started doing a little bit more video and stuff like that, which I didn't do before, and that's helped to grow a lot. And so Instagram and Facebook. I have yet to venture onto TikTok, believe it or not.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer of, because I do all of that sort of stuff myself, and stick to the things that you can do well until you have capacity to do another one well as well.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So at the moment, Facebook and Instagram, but everyone keeps telling me TikTok is a place to be for podcasters. So I guess I'll have to venture into there soon.
Yeah, yeah. How do you use those platforms? Like what's been working? Because one of the, I mean, in my other life, of course, I help brands kind of do their digital strategies. And one of the things that we keep seeing time and time again is that if you add a link or URL to anything, it reduces the chances of it being shared or spreading on the platform because the platform wants to keep people in the platform, especially Meta, Facebook specifically, because it's different on Instagram. Of course, you can't add the links there. So for you, where have you kind of been seeing success, or how have you been using these platforms to drive this engagement when the platform algorithm will punish you for driving people to your content?
Yeah. I've found that to be a big issue, especially in my genre. I've found if I use certain words in my posts, they get pushed way down, or I've even had many posts, just episode posts, completely removed by Facebook, simply because I've used words like human trafficking, or and then they think that and plus I'm attaching a link. So they think that I'm sending people to a human trafficking farm or something. I don't know what they think. But what I really think is that I've started to see social media more as a way to make people aware of the existence of the podcast rather than actually drive them from that platform directly to a listening app. And there is a gap there. So if someone wants to start a social media platform specifically for podcasters, that'll be great. But there's a gap in between those two things. But I think that's how I've been using it, is mainly to drive. When I post about new episodes, I put on Facebook, I only put the link to the episode in the comments, because that tends to stop them from removing the posts. And then on Instagram, I'll do just a normal post and then do a story later on where I link, because they allow you to link in stories. But yeah, I think for me, it's become more Facebook or social media has become more about making people aware that the podcast exists rather than specifically driving people to those platforms.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of using it, I think. And I think also an interesting view because it's kind of different to a brand that's trying to sell something. What I'm getting is as long as people know you are there and consistently know, one day they might listen, or they might listen on the day or the time that you kind of share your content. There's also, I think, something that I've asked you this in our past conversation, but about monetization and about growing the audience through that as well. So I know that you use Patreon quite a lot. There's also brand sponsorships. I want to get into the brand sponsorships conversation quite a bit. But the Patreon monetization, how has that been? And besides Patreon, how else do you monetize?
So Patreon has always been the predominant, that's starting to change now, but it's been the predominant source of income for the podcast almost since the beginning. So I started the Patreon about 9 months in, I think, and really because people were asking for it. So I've said to you before that it was quite difficult for me because of my subject matter to come to terms with having to monetize. But once the Patreon was started on request of the listeners, I was really only offering a shout out in the beginning. And we grew to like 200 Patreons just based on that. And it's continued growing since then. So yeah, that's worked really, really well. And I've started to use that now with the books as well. I've started to, obviously it's similar audiences, it's true crime. So I've started to use the Patreon for the books as well. Yeah, and then the other forms of monetization have been, as you mentioned, the brand sponsorships. And then I'm sure we can get into at some point the sort of branches off from that, which have been into the books and the partnerships with brands like Showmax and that sort of thing. That's been very helpful as well.
Yeah, I think let's get into that because I've found that to be interesting. But before we get into the partnerships and the spin-offs, which are really great things for podcasters, I want to sort of start at this space that sometimes really frightens some people, which is the space of sales, I guess, right? Like having to sell to a brand, having to make that cold call. Did you ever have to do that in the beginning? And how did you overcome that?
Mm. So interestingly, I was actually a sales manager before this. So, the sales side of it should have been okay. And it probably would have been. But I was lucky enough to actually not have to take that into consideration because what started happening was around the time that I started thinking about monetizing, brands actually started contacting me. And I'm really lucky enough that I've never had to reach out to a brand. I've always had brands that want to align themselves with the podcast, contacting me to set things up, which has just been incredible. And it's probably a bit of a unicorn situation, but I think it also speaks to brands being excited to firstly try new things, but also seeing a platform that sort of aligns with something that they'd like to be involved with, wanting to be part of the journey.
Yeah.
But, if I'd had to contact brands, I think that I would have been pretty confident in doing that because I firmly believe that podcast advertising is honestly one of the best value for money forms of advertising you can get. Evergreen. You're targeting almost exactly you can target almost exactly the audience you want, rather than hit and miss, which some other types of advertising are. And I think because I'm so passionate about the podcast and I feel like it's doing it's doing really good real world things. I think that even, if I did have to contact brands, I'd be pretty confident in selling the podcast as a product, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned the spin-offs, and I've always been fascinated by how those happen and how those conversations start. So the one that you mentioned, of course, is Showmax, and I know that you talk about some of the programs there quite a bit, some of the shows and things like that. How did that conversation begin? I know, I mean, I remember you telling me that there was somebody at Showmax or at MultiChoice who started the conversation with you, and you built on it. Again, I feel like it may have been early in your podcast journey, early in the journey of podcasts generally in South Africa. So perhaps the value conversation was kind of different in terms of what do I get for a breed or whatever, you know what I mean? So how did those conversations start, and how has it changed over time?
Sure. So I think two parts to that. Firstly, just the ordinary conversations with the brands in the beginning were actually really difficult because neither of us knew. I had no idea what podcast advertising looked like, what to charge, where we were, and neither did they. So, but it was actually really nice because we were building, all of the brands that came on board. I resonated with and liked. So we sort of paved this way together. They made suggestions, I made suggestions, and we found some middle ground on their budgets. In terms of the spin-offs, you're quite correct in saying that it was someone within Showmax that contacted me. And interestingly, it was actually an employee of theirs who was a listener. And that's almost always been the case, is it's someone who's listening to the podcast that happens to work at one of these organizations. And at that time, it was Showmax. And they were seeing that there were overseas, they were doing companion podcasts for a lot of like Netflix series and things like that. And they love true crime as well. And when Devil's Dorp, which was, I think, really one of the sort of seminal true crime television series in South Africa. When that was released in 2021, that listener who worked for Showmax contacted me and said, "Is there a way we can do something like this? And what's it going to look like?" And that was again a very much back and forth conversation. What do you think? What do I think? How much is it going to cost? But I've always been really lucky in that I've never had anyone who's really tried to do me in. I think they've all seen the value in what can be offered. And if they think I'm lowballing myself, they'll tell me so and say, we have more budget for this, which I guess is quite strange, but that happened. Yeah. And then, another spin-off has been the books. And that also happened because the publisher listened to the podcast. She was wanting to have a book published about a specific case and she just did a good Google search and found my podcast and
Yeah.
thought, well, this lady's decent storyteller. She has all the research. And that's where it started, which is crazy for South African publishing because that doesn't happen. But it did.
No, and I think I think those are really great ways of kind of doing it, because I guess that's the dream, right? Like for most creators to have someone who's already kind of invested, and that is the kind of cold call that most people feel like they have to kind of make to get to that point. There are, however, some other brands that you've then collaborated with. I can't recall what the fencing brand was, or is, that you kind of partnered with as well. What what do sponsors ask for? Ones that don't necessarily come to you, or ones that you don't have relationships with, where you have to start the conversations from scratch? What do they ask for? How do those conversations play out?
So it always starts with an email saying, we'd like to look into podcast advertising on your podcast. We're listeners or where we heard about it. And then, it's very early on, it's about education. Because a lot of the brands and, even agencies and that sort of thing that are contacting me don't really understand how podcast advertising works. And so these days, now that I know a lot more, I'm doing a lot more education about these are the different options you can do. You can do live reads, you can do dynamic inserted ads. These are the differences between the two. So a lot of it has been about education, and then they'll say, okay, we think that, or I'll advise them, I think that for your brand or whatever specific thing it is that they're wanting to promote, this would be the best option. And then from there, we start building a script that's is authentic to me and the podcast. And I just love, especially working with really open-minded people who aren't too closed off about their ideas, because we start coming up with like incredible things like, bonus episodes that are sort of curated to the brand and things like that. So that's usually how it goes.
Yeah. There's the other side of audience growth and audience development, which is promoting the podcast and kind of putting money behind ensuring that the audiences grow. Where are you doing that, first of all? And if so, where are you doing it?
So I've never done I've not personally invested in any sort of ads on social media or anything like that. I do have a website, of course, which is a monetary investment. That's very important, I think. I have done ads on Instagram when certain brands that I partnered with have asked to include that in the package that I'm doing. And so some of them will do that. They'll say, allocate whatever it is, 2,000 Rand, 2,500 to promoting this episode. And I've actually seen really good results come from that. So, that is probably something I should look into. But for the most part, my investments into getting the podcast out there has really just been consistent, putting my time into social media. And then also, I mean, doing things like this, I think, is an investment as well. Because it's this, and then, up and coming podcasters who are just starting out, I'm happy to be on their podcast because it helps them and it helps me as well. So yeah, that's pretty much what I've been doing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the I suppose that the audience grows because of the value that you put into the content, like how much content you kind of create and how well researched it is. That said, you produce a lot of content, and a lot of your content is very heavy and complex in its nature. It requires a lot of research, a lot of hours are put into it. It's not, it's not something that you could just get up on a Thursday and just do, how much how much time does it take to kind of create the content and create it weekly as you have been, and then also do a bonus episode every now and again if a brand asks for it, like that is a sort of, that's huge. That's like very demanding of your time and the research that you need to get, the information that you need to get. How much time do you spend on an episode? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, it differs from episode to episode, obviously, depending on the, depth of research and that sort of thing. I can produce, so sort of if you, because I'm going week to week, I often have research going on lots of different cases at once. So it's difficult to say how much time goes into the research itself. But if I'm, start waking up on a Monday morning and realizing I need to put out an episode by Friday, generally it's sort of 2 days research, 1 day writing script, 1 day recording and editing, and then releasing on the Friday. But that means that all of my time is, completely given to the podcast. And that's not the only thing I do. And so, yeah, it's difficult to juggle. I'll be honest with you. It's, I work a lot, but I think that I'm also lucky that it doesn't feel like work, because a lot of this I'd probably be doing anyway, like reading books about true crime and watching documentaries about true crime. But I think if there's one tip I would give in terms of keeping yourself consistent and still putting out good quality is, I think seasons in a podcast are quite important. And I didn't even think about that when I started out, which is why I've got myself in the situation I'm in. Because how do you now implement seasons into a podcast that's 200 episodes in and get people to accept that they won't have content for a month or two? And, the brands that I'm working with as well, some of them want to, have an ad every month.
Yeah.
So, if there's one tip I would give, it's definitely from the outset, um, either go only once a month or once every 2 weeks, or say that you're going to do seasons so that you have time in between to sort of work on other projects and do that sort of thing. If I could turn back time, that's what I would have done.
Yeah. Yeah. We usually look at ourselves as South African podcasters through the lens of global trends, global podcasting trends. Which trends do you think apply in South Africa and Africa of the global trends that are out there, and which ones do you think we shouldn't be too concerned about?
I think that to a certain extent, everything touches us, um, just enough to make an impact. But I think that, where we are in South Africa at the moment as a podcasting community is, I think, very much almost sort of nearing the crest of the wave, where it's been much faster uptake than other countries. And I think in that faster uptake, we see things happening slightly differently. I think that countries like the United States, where they have a lot of political podcasts, and podcasts like mine, who I wouldn't necessarily take on a political stance unless it's a human rights stance as well. A lot of podcasts in the US, for instance, take a very political leaning, where I don't know that would happen in South Africa, because I think we aren't just one side or the other. We've got a wide array of political leanings, which I'm very, very grateful for. I think that, and then, look, I think South Africa is we're in an interesting place where we do have access to technology. And, we've got access to the data, we've got access to the high-speed internet, but there's still so much of our population that doesn't have regular access to that because it's not affordable to them. So podcasters in South Africa whereas in other places they might have access to a far wider percentage of their population, we're sort of finding ourselves only being able to access people who are, let's face it, privileged enough to have access to smartphones, listening devices, data, and that sort of thing. So I think that's maybe one place that our trends in South Africa might be a bit different. And I hope that can change, because I'd like there to be, I think it's such an important platform for everyone. And I'd like that to be more sort of broader, and also to include more of our official languages, because I think a lot of our content is English and Afrikaans. And I'd love to see more and more of our other official languages coming forward in the podcasting arena.
Yeah, because that was going to kind of be my next question. I think about language in terms of these international trends, because I do see some South African vodcasts that kind of have a sort of South African language leaning to them, really blowing up, especially the video ones, in ways that if you were looking at this industry 5 years ago, looking in, advising someone, you would probably say go more English than go more South African language. And yet South African languages are definitely growing. That said, though, part of your audience is obviously an international audience. How then do you cater for that when you have a language that is only spoken or predominantly spoken in South Africa?
So I think in the beginning, I was quite concerned about making sure that everyone from across the world knew what I was talking about when I said Baki or Takis or, what a Sangoma was and that sort of thing. And where I find it educational, I do still explain. So things like the word coloured, when we have a community in South Africa that identify themselves as the coloured community. And we know that in other countries across the world, that word is a slur. So whenever I do mention that, a colored person, and when I say that phrase, I explain only because I think that could be something that could be quite offensive to someone who's just coming across a South African for the first time and may not have realized that. But also because I think it's more important that, so for me, I want to hold on to the South African authenticity. I want people from overseas I don't want to make it a South African American podcast. The beauty of our country and all of its people is actually can't be translated and explained. So, no matter how much time I try and spend explaining that stuff, it probably won't translate anyway. But I've found myself more these days only explaining the stuff that might be culturally inexplicable or not translatable, where I need to explain some sort of like labola or something like that, or if it's a muti case, explaining that behind that. And for me, that's about not having people looking at South Africa and those sort of concepts and going, oh, darkest Africa, it's so weird. But explaining to people across the world that if you grew up with this from the time that you were a child, this is your lived reality, and it's not weird, and it's part of your culture, and it's it's beautiful, and it's accepted. But as I've gone along, I've stopped explaining. Like if I say Baki, I don't say if you're in America, that's a truck. Because by the time my listeners overseas have been listening to me for 10 or 15 episodes, they've already learned that. And if they haven't, they can go Google it. It's very much, I love my international listeners. I love that these voices are being heard across the world. But my voice will always be predominantly for South Africans.
Yeah, and I think that's also a great way of defining like the audience and defining what you do for the audience, or at least who your primary audience is in this sort of global landscape. You mentioned seasons, or at least understanding that you should maybe create it in seasons. What else do you know now that you wish you knew coming in, or you wish you had started with coming into podcasting that you know now? And if you could go back again, you would actually do exactly that.
Um, so I think one of the main things is not underestimating how big you're going to get. Just because you think that your podcast is going to be a hobby, don't plan your sort of platforms and everything else that way. Because I started trying to host True Crime South Africa on my own website. And that very quickly did not go well. Because once I got to a certain number of listens, my website was crashing out every few minutes. So, get a proper hosting platform. You can get really cheap, even free ones. Iono is great, proudly South African platform. And there are other great platforms as well. And I think, really for me, one of the weirdest things was starting to get feedback from the audience and
Yeah.
finding a place where I draw the line between you cannot possibly absorb and adjust your podcast to every single person's taste. So
That must be hard though, because sorry, I'm saying that must be hard though, because you kind of want to accommodate people, right? Like, and you feel as though one unhappy listener, or at least to me, it feels like the end of the world. How do you solve for that?
Yeah, that was hard in the beginning, very much because I am a people pleaser. and by nature. So I just want everyone to love it and be happy with it. But also, I think I've got to the point where I started this with a set of values, and that's always been something that I've gone back to. So I also take things from where they come. I can see if someone is posting a comment or making a suggestion, in what spirit they are making that suggestion, or making that comment. And, some people like the background music that I have at the end of the podcast, and some people don't. And I've had to get to the point where if I like it and I feel the majority of my listeners like it, then it's got to be okay. And I think it's just come to the point where, and there are certain, I'm always open to criticism, and I'm open to people, especially in very nuanced topics that I discuss where I don't have a lived experience. Then I'll have listeners drop in and say, I don't think you actually considered it from this perspective. And then they'll give me their lived experience perspective. And I love that, because that's helpful. But you have to get to the point where you draw the line where it's not gonna, it still bugs me to a certain extent, but I think it bugs me for less long than it used to. And I've also learned not to be reactive, because I think when someone posts something clearly mean and mean spirited, it can be easy to, I would, before I would react straight away and fire back some, very equally mean comments. And what I found over the last 3 years is just really not worth it. If they are being, if their comments is actually going against the values of my podcast, so if it's actually victim blaming or something like that, I'll actually just delete it and block them from the platform.
Yeah.
Because I've got to the point where it's more important for me to have these victims' voices heard to 10 people and have one person not like it than have that one person stick around.
Nicole, lastly, what's next for your podcast, and what gives you hope about South African or the African podcasting scene?
So I think next for the podcast is definitely, I feel like almost going back to my roots. Releasing my most recent book, which is related to 10 unsolved cases I covered on the podcast, has made me realize that I need to get back to doing that type of thing again, because I haven't done unsolved cases in a long time. It's a lot more work. It's a lot riskier. And so that's really for me is the next sort of year's journey, is just getting back to the roots of what True Crime South Africa was to begin with, which is a place for these unsolved cases to be heard and to try and get new leads, and get cases reopened and that sort of thing. And now I've forgotten what the second half of your question was.
I think what gives you hope about
Okay.
the space, yeah.
Of course. Yeah, sure. I think, especially being involved in the South African Podcasters Guild, it's really nice to see new faces popping up there all the time, and people who are coming in who are from all walks of life, all sorts of young, old, all different races, all different cultures. So many people eager and excited. But most importantly, I was very concerned at one point that we would be a nation of talk show podcasts, which has its place. Don't get me wrong. That's
Sure.
cool, relaxing. It feels like you're chatting with your friends podcast. But I'm seeing more and more now that people are also interested in doing the perhaps more difficult podcasts that take a bit more research and a bit more, scripted stuff, and maybe the more serious documentary type stuff. And I'm seeing more people being eager and interested in doing those types of podcasts. So it's really exciting. I'm excited to see what comes next.
Yeah. Nicole, thank you so much for making time and for sharing your insights. It's been amazing watching the podcast grow and I suppose being part of the journey from a listener perspective and just following it. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's always lovely chatting to you.
That's it for this episode of the South African Podcast of the Month. Subscribe, share, and join the South African Podcasters Guild at sapg.co.za to grow with the community. Until next time, keep creating.